My brother was Richard Vavro. He was a well-known autistic savant with very prodigious artistic talent. Richard was 6 years older than me. He was born in 1952 and died in 2006. Richard was a very disturbed infant. It was actually very hard for my mother to get a place for him in school. She was a teacher. She wanted to go back to work and she needed somewhere to be like a nursery or early years care. And because of his challenges, he was really quite difficult. Eventually, she found somebody locally in a place called Cooper in Fife in Scotland. And a very, very nice lady there called Molly Leishman took Richard on, encouraged him to kind of settle down. He would scream quite a lot. He would be staring at the sun, staring at light on water, that kind of thing. So you could see this very intense interest in light, and she eventually settled him by giving him some crayons or some chalks, and he was drawing on a chalkboard. He seemed to like that. Eventually, she saw him drawing some pretty good shapes, quite advanced for his kind of age, when he was maybe 3, 4, 5 years old. She wanted to kind of encourage that on paper, so she tried to transition him from the chalkboard onto paper with crayons. The story goes that one day he produced something that was really quite exceptional. And she was thinking, did Richard really do that? It kind of went on from there. So with autistic savants with a kind of art in intensity, one of the characteristics is being able to draw in perspective straight away. If you have a look at some of Richard's pictures from early days, you can see that they're in perspective. So if you compare that with a normal kid's just 2D flat, or just flat images, like a tree. You can imagine our car, it's just a sideways view of a car with wheels. Richard would draw it in perspective. You could see the car coming out of the paper, going away, and so on. So Richard just developed his talent, and then it became very obvious that his talent was something special. The interesting thing about Richard is his technique is completely self-developed, so nobody's taught him anything, and he liked to work with wax crayons, eventually gravitating to Swiss-made crayons, companies called Canon Dash, and he became really, really good at layering colours and using colour perspective, really quite advanced techniques. And he did that without anyone showing him how to do it. And the most remarkable thing was that he was legally blind. He had very poor eyesight. So he was born with cataracts in his eyes. So they removed that as a newly born child. He got most of his vision from one eye. Nobody really knows it's how he was doing it. But when you see his art, it just doesn't stack up that he was doing this with poor vision in one eye. How on earth is he doing that? Just to give you an example of what he was doing, he would draw anything. He would draw what he had for breakfast, or what he was, the bus that took him to school, anything, so he was drawing his reality. And then, what he did during the day, he would just draw it. He was obviously late in speaking. It would just be single words, so really forming sentences he didn't do. He spoke in a kind of whisper until he was about 12, possibly to do with his voice breaking or something like that. He then started to speak out loud, maybe at the age of 12, and he would maybe string together 2 or 3 words. He did have brain damage, so there was a problem, and during my mum's pregnancy, that seemed to affect his verbal processing. So one particular area, if you asked, he really struggled with dealing with questions. He could express himself to say what his needs were and if he was liking something or not liking something. But he was certainly non-verbal to begin with. And I guess it just developed with his art. I don't think there was a sort of breakthrough. His art either got better or plateaued once he started to speak a bit. He was just always into it. He drew and drew every day. It was a passion. I could understand Richard, so I was like the best at understanding what Richard was trying to say. So if he was trying to say something and my mum or dad couldn't figure out what he was saying, I would get brought into the room and, what's Richard actually trying to say? And I would listen hard. I would work it out what Richard was actually saying. He became more and more interested in just his visual life. Obviously, he would watch television. He would like to draw some of the interesting stuff that he saw on television. A big breakthrough was going from black and white TV to colour TV. In the UK, that was probably around 1970, something like that. Early 70s would have been when colour came in. He was very interested in nature programmes. The BBC nature programmes are high standard, and he used to really like watching those. He really liked looking at books. So his favourite activity was to go to one of the big bookshops in Edinburgh and browse in the picture book categories, the books about different countries, different animals and so on like that. And he would study those and really close. So he would, because of the poor eyesight, you'd have it up close and he would kind of scan the book and then you'd put the book back. I mean, occasionally he would buy a book, that would be a treat to buy a book, take it back home and so on. But he never drew anything with a book open in front of him. So all this was being, retained in memory. So, I mean, one of the most remarkable things about what he was doing was he was doing all this stuff from memory. And you couldn't forecast when he was actually going to draw something. He might see a picture book about South Africa or something like that. And then maybe 3 or 4 months later, he produced a very nice picture, Table Mountain or something. And then you say, well, where's that? South Africa, And that was obviously just being processed. And then he would decide just to draw it. At the end of the year, so New Year was important to him. He would mark the end of a year with a kind of almost like a sunset, a dusk scene. And that's like him marking the end of the year and then the start of the new year. So I think that's something quite in common with a lot of people with autistic characteristics. It's very important for them to know where they are in their times, linear time. They want to know just exactly what they're doing in tomorrow, in a week's time and so on. And repetition features quite heavily. So they like having let's say a weekly or a monthly event. And so Richard was marking his annual event. Well, I've got a very good one above my fireplace. It's called Wash Day in Pakistan. And that's Richard kind of at the peak of his powers, where it's got a complex composition. There's worshippers kind of bathing in the river, and it's just a really nice composition. There's lots of really bright colours in it, and yeah, he's done a great job there. But if I was presented with a blank sheet of paper and said, right, draw something, I'd have to sit there for a while and think, well, what am I going to draw and how would I draw it and all this kind of thing. That's just not what Richard does. You give him a blank sheet of paper, he's straight into it and he's drawing straight away. He's just hammers it down. And he would draw one really pretty complex picture every couple of days. Laterally, once he developed his technique where it was edge to edge, one, as I say, complex picture, a couple hundred a year. So we've catalogued something like 2,500, and that's not the complete. There'll be earlier works, there'll be some that would be missed and so on. So the most curious thing that he did, and again, is completely inexplicable, was we had a National Geographic book or magazine that listed all the flags of the countries in the world. So there's something like 200 odd flags. And you could point to any of those flags and Richard would tell you what the country was. That was really quite a mysterious thing for me. I remember the feeling when I first realised what he was doing. I tried to catch him out a couple of times, a couple of obscure countries, and he would just tell you what the country was. I had no idea how he was doing that. So the only possibility to me, it seems, is that somebody took him through all of that, and because he's got just a unbelievable memory, he just managed to remember every single one, in 1 or 2 goes. But that's not the sort of thing that people used to do with Richard, and I don't know. I've seen various attempts to categorize all sorts of different autistic people or people behaviors. I think that's probably the danger, is you try to shoehorn somebody in and say he is an autistic savant or he is neurodivergent in this way, or we used to say Asperger's. I don't think Asperger's is an approved term anymore. It was well into maybe the late 70s or 80s I first heard Richard described as autistic or autistic savant. So previously, he would just have been called severely mentally retarded. So, as part of that journey and as part of us learning about these special people, we know he was no longer severely mentally retarded. He was an autistic savant. But autism, the typical characteristics are isolation and communication issues where you don't actually say very much. You don't laugh. You don't dance. Richard really enjoyed company. So he was very social, enjoyed company. He had a great sense of humour, and he liked to dance as well. In many ways, he ticks quite a lot of the boxes of autism, and, so he would spin, he would repeat stuff to himself, a lot of repetition, a lot of spinning, all sorts of stuff. But then he would laugh, and he would be very social and enjoy company. So, the attempts to try and frame it or scope it, the danger is that it is not valid for many people. So I remember there was a van came from the Department of Psychology at Edinburgh University. I would have been about 12 at the time. They carried out an IQ test with Richard. So this is, if I was about 12, yes, so it's about 1970. There was all sorts of different tests and so on, but basically they had an IQ test, and it's like flashcards. Like, what's this or what's that and all this. I knew Richard very well, of course. I just knew that he wasn't really engaging with this and all the rest of it. So they solemnly declared that Richard had an IQ of 30 after their studies. And I'm thinking, I'm 12, and I know that test is just completely invalid. It's meaningless. Why on earth would you do that? What's that going to tell you? Richard didn't perform on that test. I could have told you that when I was 12. I would contrast, this failure to do an IQ test properly. So Richard was very much a music lover, so music was a big part of his life. He'd always be listening to music, and all sorts of music, and sounds, all sorts of different sounds, even tones, just single tones, but he loved music. He liked church music as well, so he liked the ritual of going to Mass. My dad took him to Mass, and he liked that. It was once a week again, this weekly thing that he did, met people, he would listen to the music. Quite often I would see Richard, and he would, the best way for him to listen to music was with headphones, so he'd be sitting there listening to, some, let's say, classical piece. And you could see him just sitting there contemplating, So he was obviously extremely thoughtful, thinking very deeply. There's just an awful lot going on in there, and you contrast that with somebody saying, no, he's got an IQ of 30, he's incapable of practically anything. So Richard wasn't capable of independent living. I think it's fair to say he probably never could have been. So the problem you get with children, young adults and so on, as Richard grew up, is that the parents are overprotective, quite naturally. That's what happens. Richard ended up always having stuff done for him pretty much his entire life. So if you treat somebody like a 4-year-old, he's going to act like a 4-year-old, especially if as you carry on. So Richard, I don't think really had a chance to learn how to live and to do more for himself. My first job was in Glasgow. My dad and Richard were living in Edinburgh. We were all the family was. Dad and Richard came through for the weekend. I think it was the first weekend I had this new apartment, and they came through, and they thought it was great and all the rest of it. And Richard declared to me, he said, "Cup of tea, please." Like that. I said, "Richard, go make it yourself." He looked kind of shocked and laughed. And then it was like he's, caught him with his hand in the cookie jar. Something like that. And he went and made a cup of tea. If you challenged Richard like that, he wouldn't, he'd know how to do it. I think it's really common for people like Richard to be overprotected, but it's very understandable. But we never really understood what Richard was really capable of. He wouldn't be capable of independent travel. It wouldn't have been safe for him to, say, get on a bus and go somewhere to meet somebody. It would work if you said, right, get this, if you knew that the bus came at 10:15, you get on that bus and you get off here, and you would probably be able to do that. The problem is, of course, the bus doesn't come at 10:10, or the bus stops or goes somewhere else. It's the anomalies that Richard wouldn't be able to handle. He was an amazing percussionist, and one of the things which in hindsight I really, really would have liked to have tried would have been to set him up with either a drum kit or probably, I think what he would have been really good at would have been Indian tune drums, like tabla, and I think he could have played those really, really well, because he was always beating our rhythms, but he was really, really on the money when it came to rhythmic stuff. And I think it would have been, amazing to see what he would have done. If somebody had just showed him, right, you fold it here, this is how you do it, this is how you get the different sounds out, he would have just taken off. But I never got the chance. There's various theories around about how these savants are operating. this incredible and intense skill in one area, whether it's music or art or whatever. Mostly they've got completely amazing memories, so they can listen to a 5-minute piece of music and play it back. Richard was obviously just taking in everything. What was interesting about Richard was that he would take elements from a scene and recompose them as, to make a good picture, to balance a picture. He's often mentioned in the same breath as another British artist called Stephen Wilshire. So Stephen Wilshire draws black and white landscapes. Typically they're cityscapes, so his speciality is black and white, pen and ink type things of cityscapes. And his gotcha is being taken over a city, a new city, in a helicopter. So they're flying over the city, he lands, and then the next day he draws it perfectly. Absolutely perfectly. So allegedly he can't count. So if you count up like there's a 50-floor building, there'll be 50 floors. You can count them, and it's absolutely perfect. So yeah, sure, that's really amazing. How's he doing that? And Richard was kind of, as I say, mentioned in the same breath. Richard's stuff is incredibly colourful, so his use of colour is spectacular. But he wouldn't draw a complete analogue of the picture, or a facsimile of the picture. He would change stuff in it as he saw fit. So Richard was discovered by the art establishment when he was about 16. So there was a well-known arts entrepreneur in Edinburgh, a man called Richard DeMarco, with his own gallery. And he'd heard about Richard in passing, so he came round to the house and declared that this was amazing, and he was going to have an exhibition, and he had so his best works were selected and framed, hung up, lit properly, and Richard had a room to himself, and they looked amazing. The one thing about Richard's medium, these crayons, is that when they're floodlit, when they're really lit properly, they really kind of reflect the light beautifully, and they're very rich colours. So Richard's pictures looked amazing when they were framed and properly lit. So that was kind of the start of Richard's career as a kind of recognised artist. From then on, there was exhibitions all over the place, all over the UK, Poland, in the States. He started having exhibitions in the US about 1979, 1980, around about that time. He was the invited artist at one of the first Special Olympics events. That was in Rochester in Upper New York State. We were being given this marquee, and this marquee was full of Richard's works. I took Richard. My mum was very ill at the time, so my dad and mum stayed back in Scotland. I took Richard with a friend, so there was 3 of us. Yeah, we just had such a great time. We met the Kennedys, and it was Gene Kennedy Smith that started off the Special Olympics. And yeah, we went all over the States being interviewed. And Richard was, he's a very interesting person, so there'll be lots of television and radio programs about him. One of the big breakthroughs was a US national TV program called That's Incredible. So in the 70s, far fewer channels, and this is one of the programs that people used to like to watch, was That's Incredible. It was mainly offbeat kind of stuff, like a dog that helped sell used cars. But then one of the first real strong human interest stories that they had was Richard. So they did a really nice segment about Richard on That's Incredible. And, then there was a huge flurry of interest in Richard and his work. Margaret Thatcher opened one of his exhibitions in London when she was Minister of Education in the UK. And she bought some of these. I think she bought half a dozen and something like that. And she, at one point, many years later, she was visiting Edinburgh. She visited my mum, and she told the press. They said, "Oh, where are you going?" She said, "I'm going to visit the mother of my favourite artist, Richard Vavro." So that was fun. There was 3 channels in the UK at the time, and everyone would watch nationwide. It was at 6 p.m. That's what you did. And it was a magazine programme. There was news, and then they would have various stories from around the nation. They decided that they would do a human interest programme on Richard, and it was, I can't remember, it was 10 or 12 minutes long, which was more than double the length of any segment that they'd made before. And when they ran that, and it created this huge interest. His next exhibition was in Glasgow, and we were completely overwhelmed. It was almost like we almost had to call the police for crowd control. There were so many people wanting to come to the gallery. But what was good about that was at the end of the year, when they were showing the highlights of the year, so the nationwide highlights of the year, they showed Richard's programme again because it had created a lot of interest. I think what's interesting about Richard, it really resonates with people. You can clearly see from the films about Richard that he's got a lot of challenges, but yet, he's producing these amazing pictures. So, and then you hear about his eyesight, and then you hear that he's not reading, he's not reading. You see that you can see him looking at pictures, and he's looking at them like an inch or two away. And so it's like really interesting, and it makes you really think that, what are we all capable of? What kind of skills could we have? How amazing the brain is and how amazing some people are. Richard started off his life, his arc, his journey. He started off as a very, very disturbed infant and ended up kind of fulfilled through his art. He really was happy, and he knew that he was responsible because of his art. He could visit different countries. He went as far as Hawaii. All around the world, people were interested in him, and he did know that. He appreciated that people liked his art, and he would smile and love it. He would call himself an international artist. So he liked all of that. So it's quite remarkable to think that somebody that had those challenges was able to have a career that would take him all around the world, and have a lot of fulfillment through it.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, consider supporting the channel by checking out the link in the description. See you in the next one.